Hello and welcome to the last section of Chapter 22 of the American Pageant, the Ordeal of Reconstruction, or as Cajun man might say it, Reconstruction. We're looking at we're going the realities of radical Reconstruction in the South through the heritage of Reconstruction. We left off talking about radical Reconstruction, the third of the three plans for rebuilding the South and the nation after the Civil War. You had Lincoln's plan, which never really was fully put into play. Johnson's plan, which was put into plan, but then Congress refused to seat the newly elected members of the South. And the radical plan of the Republicans was to punish the South, to divide them up into military districts, 10 states that remained, 5 military districts, occupy them, force them to have new state governments, ratifying the 14th Amendment, and barring Confederates from office. And so this chart here kind of shows when they were readmitted under radical Reconstruction. Tennessee was never occupied because they ratified the 14th Amendment before 1866, so they're in. And then, so you have Arkansas, North Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana. And then over here, you have when they reestablished home rule. That's what we're going to look at today, is who ruled without all the Confederates in the South being able to participate. Because of this, many Southerners, most Southerners, especially the Democrats, refused to participate. So it allowed a lot of different people, Republicans, and other various groups to serve in government. And so this date over here was when they were redeemed, when things went back to normal in the South. Federal troops, kind of some comments here, they were restationed in 1877 with the fiasco of the election of 1876. And then Georgia actually was readmitted, but then they had the military had to go back because they expelled African Americans from the legislature. And then one other thing here, I think is just funny here. For many years, Tennessee was the only state of secession to observe Lincoln's birthday as a legal holiday. Many of them still observe the birthdays of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. Oh boy, that's that whole controversy with Confederate statues, and oh yeah, let's just get into the notes. So the realities of radical Reconstruction. So in the South, to help African Americans, you have the Union League in addition to the Freedmen's Bureau, which originally was a pro-union organization. It was a network of political clubs that educated members and campaigned for Republican candidates. African Americans, with the newly right to vote from the 1870 15th Amendment, they voted Republican, the party of Lincoln. This group built black churches, African American schools. It represented African American grievances to local employers and governments. Recruited militias to protect African Americans from white retaliation. So we did a lot of good things in the South. New groups take charge, though, with the right to vote means that African Americans can serve in office. And so African Americans in the South vote Republican, with the Confederates being banned and a lot of Democrats refusing to participate in radical Reconstruction. It opens the door for the Republicans to run a lot of these states. And so you get the first African Americans in government. They held important positions. 16 were elected to the House. 2 were elected to the Senate from 1869 to 1880. The 2 first senators were Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. That's kind of a feminine name, but it's a man, Blanche K. Bruce. So in the South, they don't have very kind terms for them. You have scallywags, which I'm going to challenge you to a duel and smack you with a glove, you scallywag. If you're a Southerner, no self-respecting Southerner would ever be a Republican back then. And so this, oh my, you're a Southerner and you're a Republican, you're a scallywag. You also get carpetbaggers. You know, there's a power vacuum, and so there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of construction going on. A lot of Northerners come down and live in the South and be elected to offices there. And the fashion of the day was the luggage was made out of bags of carpet. And this is kind of a grainy photo, but it shows, like the liberty of the South breaking her back, carrying, the huge burden of the carpetbagger, being escorted by federal troops against her will. So there's charges of corruption, and there was a lot of corruption, but that was normal in the United States. Government contracts are being handed out all over the country, and you have political machines, you have graft, you have favors, you have kickbacks. That was kind of the status quo. Doesn't make it okay, but because these groups were different than the traditional Southern leaders, the charges of corruption were more boisterous, and so more loud about, hey, you scallywags, you carpetbaggers, you African Americans in office, you're stealing money. Everyone else was not making it okay. This is actually John R. Lynch. He was a representative in Congress from Mississippi. Kind of a cool, significant thing there. So in retaliation to this, because the South doesn't take it lying down, you have the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which is, after the Greek symbol for circle and all that stuff. It's the invisible empire of the South. It was founded in Tennessee by Nathan Bedford Forrest in 1866. The group worked through violence and intimidation. They dressed as the ghost of the Confederacy to intimidate and beat up and flat out kill African Americans and their supporters. They often killed blacks. The number of lynchings skyrockets in the South because of this. They dressed up in their little costumes here and even dressed up their horses. And in retaliation, Congress passes the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871 to try to give a little bit more oomph to take on the Klan with the federal government. The military, which is occupying the South, that kind of largely becomes their task, is to try to protect African Americans from the KKK. And so it enabled federal troops to stop the atrocities of the KKK. It was too late. The KKK was super effective. It intimidated many people. They didn't register to vote. They didn't speak out. And by the end of Reconstruction, when the federal troops pull out in 1877, the KKK largely disappears. It's reborn in 1915 in Stone Mountain, Georgia, because of a movie, The Birth of a Nation, by D.W. Griffith. We'll get into that in later chapters. So while this is all going on, Congress decides, we've made the South the way we want. Now let's go after Johnson. He's been vetoing our bills. He's been a thorn on our side. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act. We don't like him. So they're going to challenge him. And so they passed the Tenure of Office Act to limit the power of the president. They were fearful that this gentleman here, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, was going to get fired. So they were trying to protect him. The Tenure of Office Act said the president could not fire his cabinet members without congressional approval. Like I said, it was just to keep his job. He was spying on Johnson for the Republicans. Johnson had a spy in his own cabinet. Oh boy, sounds like a movie. And so Johnson, of course, being the grumpy gills he is, just fires him and says, "What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it, huh?" So they impeach him. For the first time in American history, the president is impeached. The House of Representatives impeaches, which means formally charges with crimes and high crimes and misdemeanors. And at that point, he's put on trial in the Senate. So we've had 3 presidents impeached. President Johnson, you have President Clinton in the 90s, and then President Trump. All were acquitted by the Senate. Now, Richard Nixon was going to be impeached, but before they could do it, he resigned and did his thing. So there you go. This is a recreation of a ticket. You could go watch it like a spectator sport. Let's watch the impeachment of the president. So the representatives prosecuted, the Senate were served as the court to try Johnson on these charges. Johnson argued the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional. He's correct, it is. He fired Stanton to challenge this act before the Supreme Court. Didn't think that he would be impeached. He thought it would go up to the Supreme Court, and they would be the ones that would rule on the constitutionality of this. On May 16, 1868, the Senate voted the president not guilty by a single vote. They failed to get the 2/3 majority to remove the president. Some senators thought that, voting not guilty was smart. They didn't want to tear down the whole system of checks and balances. They didn't want to, disintegrate the fabric of the Constitution. His acquittal does prove that checks and balances that our founding fathers put into the Constitution worked. They were trying to remove the president just for his political views. Others voted no because they didn't like his replacement. The economic policies of the Vice President Ben Wade were not appealing. And so all you anti-Trumpers out there, you want to get rid of Trump and impeach him, careful what you ask for. You get President Pence, and I'm not sure if you want that or not either. So kind of a little side note in history. And then totally random, they just throw in the purchase of Alaska in this chapter about Reconstruction. Yes, chronologically speaking, it happens in this era, but usually you put it with the imperialistic chapter where the United States is, looking at the open door in China and trying to trade with Japan and hanging out in Hawaii. But anyway, William Seward, the Secretary of State, bought Alaska for $7.2 million from Russia. Surprised we didn't sell it for a case of beets and vodka. But hey, $7.2 million was less than half a cent an acre. Russia had overexpanded in North America. They also wanted to strengthen the United States against their rival, the British. And so we bought Alaska, and everyone's like, what are you doing? It's full of ice and polar bears. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox. But then, hey, we found gold and turned out to be a good thing. This is how big Alaska is now. I mean, not now, but compared to the United States. It's usually put in a corner of a map and not very big. Here's the check we wrote, to the Tsar. $7.2 million. There you go. Right there. It's even been cashed. So back to what we've been talking about, the heritage of Reconstruction. It's random, like this chapter at ADD, like, oh, hey, look, Alaska, cool. Well, back to Reconstruction. Many white Southerners felt that Reconstruction was actually more painful than the war itself. During Reconstruction, the Republican Party really tried to protect African Americans, to protect those freed slaves, and promote the fortunes of the Republican Party. African Americans vote for the party of Lincoln almost uniformly until the 1930s, until the Great Depression. Then they switched. The principles removed the party from the South for nearly 100 years. It's not until the 60s and 70s that the Republicans returned to win elections in the South. Despite good intentions by the Republicans, the Reconstruction didn't really change anything. When federal troops were pulled out after the Compromise of 1877 to give Rutherford B. Hayes the election, it's like the North kind of ran out of interest for Reconstruction. And when those troops left, so did the fortunes of African Americans. The political rights were dashed. They were taken away through a series of black codes, through Jim Crow laws, through violence and intimidation and lynching. And so they were returned to second-class citizenship. Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of the radical Republicans, he had this radical program of drastic economic reforms to try to help African Americans be economically equal, which then allows a lot of social equality and political equality. Doesn't do it. He also didn't have an extensive protection for political rights. And so largely when Reconstruction ends and Stevens dies, this kind of ends the dream of the voice of African Americans in government. And so because of that, you have civil rights movements that start getting going in the teens and the 20s, and then in the 40s and 50s and the 60s. The 50s and 60s, the big one. But during the teens, you have Marcus Garvey and you have W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And so in response to that, the South tries to intimidate blacks more. And so they construct all these Confederate monuments. They weren't built right after the war. They were built in the early 20th century to intimidate and remind African Americans of who they should be in their mind. And so the program was never enacted. The civil rights era that we know that we're going to cover in great detail in the 50s and 60s with Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Stokely Carmichael and Bob Moses and Malcolm X. You can go on and on and on. Largely necessitated because of the failure of Reconstruction. That's all I have for you guys. This is my last video. I said that in an earlier video, but I forgot about this chapter. I made 128 of these. So if you sat through 128 of these, if you watched all of them, you deserve a medal. You deserve something. You are a champion. You know what? When I'm elected president, I'll give you a cabinet position. And I won't fire you so I don't get impeached. Thank you for tuning in.